Hello, troublemakers. Welcome to this week's episode of Resolved Labor Podcast. I am your host, Lynn Fields, and this week we will be highlighting Rose Schneiderman. Rose Schneiderman was born April 16th, 1882. Shout out to the Aries, to devout Jewish parents, Samuel, who was a tailor, and Deborah Rothman. She was born in Savin, Poland. Now, Samuel, he was a tailor, and Miss Deborah, her mom, she did a little bit of everything. She did sewing, she baked ritual breads, she sewed uniforms for the Russian army, she treated the sick with homemade remedies, and then sometimes she would tend the bar when the local barkeep was too drunk to do it himself. Girl, look, that's what I'm talking about. Like, man, give me my drinks. Oh, you too drunk? I'll do it. Her parents were not traditionalists, as you can see. And when Rose was 4, her parents put her in school, which wasn't the norm at this time. When she was 6, the family moved so that Rose could continue her education at a Russian public school. In 1890, the family migrated to New York City. Then in 1892, 2 years later, her father died of meningitis. He left behind 3 children and of course, Deborah, who at the time was pregnant. Deborah did all she could to support the family. She rented out rooms to boarders. She sewed and worked for neighbors and even did odd jobs as a handyman. But even with all that, it wasn't enough to keep the family afloat. And for a time, Rose and her siblings, they actually had to go and live in an orphanage. But y'all know that Rose's mom, Deborah, she was not having that. Those kids was right back with her, like in turnaround time. Like she got back on her feet and, the kids were returned home. Deborah worked nights so that Rose could go to school in the day because that's just how important, she felt like the education of her children were. But in 1895, for whatever reason, Deborah lost her job and 13-year-old Rose was forced out to leave school and to get a job. Deborah went to the United Hebrew Charter, and this was an organization ran by middle class German Jewish men, and begged them to get her daughter, quote, a respectable job. And, but by respectable job, she means at a department store. Because in Deborah's mind, working retail was more respectable than working in the factory. Plus, it was believed that the retail environment was cleaner, safer, and I don't know why, but people thought that the sexual harassment there was less prevalent. And she figured working a retail job would fast track Rose into the middle class. Okay, Deborah, she she done thought of everything. But guess what, y'all? RESPECT don't pay the RENT. And back then, just like now, blue collar jobs paid more than what was considered, quote, pink collar jobs at that time. So after 3 years as a sales girl, the now 16-year-old Rose asked a friend to train her as a cap maker. Once she became proficient in this new skill, of course, Rose started making more money. But she also noticed, the bullshit that came with it. Like the men were getting paid more and women were, getting the worst jobs, less pay. And it started kind of wearing on Rose and she kind of started griping about it. And when she started expressing her festivity to the older workers, I mean, is festivity a word? I don't know. It just feels right, right? It just feels right. When she started expressing this to the other workers, the older workers, they were like, "Girl, come here. It's time for you to learn about the 3 big isms." And she was like, "What's the 3 big isms?" And they were like, unionism, socialism, and feminism. In 1903, at 21 years old, all 4'9" of her, and with a head full of fiery red hair, Rose start with a friend, decided that the time was right to start organizing the workers. They applied for a charter with the United Cloth, Hat, and Cap Makers Union. The union told them to come back when they had 25 women ready. The mission was successful within days, and the union chartered its first women's local. In 1905, Rose was elected secretary of her local and a delegate to the New York City Central Labor Union. Through the Central Labor Union, she connected with the Women's Trade Union League. They were an organization that lent out moral and financial support to women workers who were wanting to organize. So after leading a successful cap maker strike when she was 23 years old, Rose quickly became one of the most prominent members of the local. And she was, eventually elected the New York City chapter vice president in 1908. That year, she left the factory to work for the Women's Trade Union League. And they also paid for her education as well. So they gave her a stipend to work for them and also continue her education. So this was like dream job for her. So she would just go around, organizing a lot of the factories. So at this time, American textile workers, as we know, particularly women, were subjected to terrible working conditions. The factories were crowded, unsanitary. The workers worked 65 hours per week. And when something was in season, the workers worked up to 75 hours a week. The women earned $3 to $4 a day, while the men, they earned between $7 and $12 a day. And on top of this, the workers were required to provide their own materials. This included the needles, the thread, and the sewing machines. Like, can y'all imagine walking to work back and forth with one of them big ass sewing machines? But okay, they would be fined for being late or damaging a garment that they were working on. And at some work sites, like the Triangle Shirtwaist Company, steel doors were used to lock the workers in to prevent them from taking breaks. And like if they did want to go to use the bathroom, they would have to go ask the manager. He would unlock the door and then he would basically pat them down to make sure that they weren't stealing any extra, garments or fabric or silk thread. So they would get searched in and out of the work area. Now, just a quick pause, troublemakers. A shirt waist is basically a blouse. It's a blouse, but they called them shirt waists at the time, and they were mass produced, because everybody was wearing them. Like rich women was wearing them, poor women was wearing them. So it was a hot commodity back then, like the puffy coat, right? So production at this time was split between 600 shops and factories in New York City alone. They were employing about 30,000 workers and producing as much as $50 million worth of merchandise annually. Can I just say, like, real quick, we don't need no more clothes, America. We're done. Okay, we're done. We should just stop making clothes. We have way too many fucking clothes. So on November 22nd, 1909, a meeting organized by the International Ladies Garment Workers Union voted for a general strike. And on the 24th of November, 15,000 workers walked out. On the 25th, the number swelled to 20,000, with some reporting up to 30,000. The strike became known as the Uprising of the 20,000. The strikers demanded a 20% raise, less hours, overtime pay, and improved safety conditions. The factory owners, these two dudes named Max Blanc and Isaac, named Blanc and Isaac, told the strikers to go pound sand. They ain't giving them shit. These are the owners of the Triangle Waste Factory. And instead of paying the workers, they paid thugs and prostitutes to attack the strikers. Y'all, how did the sex workers get in this? But okay, so they paid these thugs and prostitutes to attack the strikers and paid the police to arrest them for petty infractions. The strikers gained sympathy from a group of wealthy women in the upper class New York City society. So this group was called the Colony Club, and it included Anne Tracy Morgan, who was the daughter of J.P. Morgan. Yes, that J.P. Morgan. Another prominent person who was a member of the Colony Club was Alva Belmont, and she's the ex-wife of William Vanderbilt. Now, the crazy part about this colony club, right, with all these rich women, is that they did not allow Jewish women in this club. And the majority of strikers were Jewish women. So, this group of wealthy women, dubbed, quote, the Mink Brigade, took to the picket lines with the strikers. And so, when the rich people started getting arrested, this made front page news because when the poor folks, when it was just them getting beat up and arrested, nobody really cared. But when these rich people started getting arrested, like this was a very, very big deal and it got some folks' attention. Now, one of the socialist newspapers at this time, they actually, criticized the hypocrisy and the prejudice of these women who joined the protest because it's like, is this performative? Do y'all really care for real though? And I don't know, y'all. I mean, it wasn't no Hulu back then. So, go on and join this protest so we can be outside. I don't know. So the strike lasted until February 1910, and the workers returned to work. The strikers won a wage increase, they won shorter hours, and equal treatment between the union and non union workers. Why? Because, you know, tides lifting all boats and all that, right? So, however, the management, they did refuse to sign an agreement, but it was like a gentleman's agreement, they would get all these things. And they also refused to address the safety conditions such as the locked doors and condemned fire escapes. Yes, there were condemned fire escapes. So here's a little tea about these owners, right? Blanc and Harris, like they had this reputation in the business world for, for factory fires. So the Triangle Factory, which this is the one that we're talking about, it had already been burned two other times in 1902. And then another company that they owned, the Diamond Waste Company, it burned in 1907 and 1910.
Hey, this is Mark, your host on My Labor Radio, and we're proud to be part of the Labor Radio Podcast Network with more than 200 labor radio shows and podcasts from across the country and around the world. The Labor Radio Podcast Network, where working people speak. Find us at laborradionetwork.org.
Now, y'all know with all these fires, the streets was talking, and some people suspected that, that they were deliberately burning their factories to collect the large insurance policies. Some said this is why sprinkler systems weren't installed in any of their factories. On March 25th, 600 workers were, inside this building and, on the factory floor, right? A fire started in a rag bin. The manager tried to put the fire out, but the hose was rotted and the valve was rusted shut. You guys, I'm going to pause right here. And before I, keep going, I just want to give you guys a trigger warning. Like, I know that there's been violence in past episodes and things of that nature, but this is going to be kind of graphic. So, trigger warning. Yeah, you might want to like skip this part if you're bothered by violence. So the elevator could only, this fire started. They couldn't get the fire out. The elevator could only hold 12 people at a time. The elevator made 4 trips, up and down before, it succumbed and broke down because of the fire and the smoke. The majority of the girls, majority of the workers, like we had said before, were young girls between like 14 and 19 years old. Some of the girls jumped down the shaft, to their demise once the elevator stopped working. The workers who used the stairs were met with locked doors once they got to the bottom, and they burned to death. The girls who didn't make it to the stairwells or to the elevator began to jump from windows to escape. The bodies landed on the fire hose from the fire truck, making it difficult to fight the fire. And then, like some of the nets that they put out, because multiple amounts of girls were jumping at the same time, a lot of the nets broke because 2 and 3 bodies would fall into the net, causing it to break. The firefighters' ladders only reached the 7th floor, and the factory where the fire was, it was on the 8th floor. The workers above the fire, including the owners and their children who were in the building with them at the time, they managed to escape. They went upstairs and they escaped from the roof. Within 18 minutes, 49 workers had burned to death or suffocated by the smoke. 36 were found in the elevator shaft, and 58 died from jumping, with 2 more dying from their injuries. The total casualties were 146. Despite all the evidence of negligence by the owners and management, a jury failed to indict them for manslaughter charges. In a lawsuit settlement, each family was paid $75. The insurance company, however, paid the owners $400 per death, which equated to about $60,000. On April 2nd, 1911, Rose gave a speech held at the Metropolitan Opera House. It was a commemoration ceremony for the victims of the fire. She said, "I can't talk fellowship to you who are gathered here. Too much blood has been spilled. I know from my experience it is up to the working people to save themselves. The only way they can save themselves is by a strong working class movement." In October 1911, New York passed the Sullivan-Hoey fire prevention law in response to the Triangle Shirtwaist Fire. It required factory owners to install sprinkler systems. It established the New York City Fire Prevention Bureau and expanded the powers of the fire commissioner. Today, the Brown Building, which is located in Manhattan, it's part of the NYU campus, which owns it. And it was designated a New York City landmark in 2003. NYU uses the building for their chemistry and biology classes. But there is a memorial that's set up for commemoration of the Triangle Waist Shirt Factory. In 1912, Rose gave a speech that is credited with coining one of the most memorable, phrases of the women's labor movement. Rose is quoted as saying, quote, when asked what the working woman wants, she says, "What the woman who labors wants is the right to live, not simply exist. The worker must have bread, but she must have roses too." Rose was a founding member of the ACLU. She became friends with Franklin and Eleanor Roosevelt. In 1926, she was elected as the national president of the Women's Trade Union, a post she held until her retirement in 1933. From 1937 to 1944, she was Secretary of Labor for New York State. In 1949, Rose retired from public life, making occasional radio speeches and appearances for different unions. She published her memoirs in 1967 under the title All for One. She was never married or had children, but she was known for being the world's greatest aunt. I can relate, Rose. She had a long, however, the T, y'all know it's always a little bit of T. T is she had a long-term relationship with a woman named Maud O'Farrell Schwartz, who was a fellow working class woman and union activist. Now, it was never confirmed that they were in a relationship or a romantic relationship, but we do know that they lived together, they traveled together, and they gave gifts together. Gave gifts like, "Hey girl, it's your birthday. Love your besties, not the resties, Moes." I don't know if Maud and Rose called themselves Moes, but it just feels right. Now, Rose was asked about Maud on several occasions, and the only description that she's on record as ever, saying about Maud was that, quote, "She was a wonderful companion," end quote. So y'all just take that for what y'all want it to be. Rose died on August 11th, 1972, at the age of 90. In her obituary, she is credited with teaching Eleanor and Franklin Roosevelt most of what they knew about unions. End quote. So now, troublemakers, we are at the part of the show where we give our flowers. Because we do not wait for people to retire. We do not wait for them to no longer be with us before we give them their appreciation. And this week, I would like to give appreciation and give flowers to Emily E. Twarg. Now, I have known Emily for years and I still mess up her last name. So forgive me if you are listening to this right now. She is a professor of history and labor studies at the University of Illinois School of Labor and Employment Relations Labor Education Program and co-director of the Regina V. Polk Labor Leadership Conference. She earned her doctorate in American history at the University of Illinois in Chicago and a master's in labor studies at the University of Massachusetts Amherst Labor Resource and Research Center. She has a book called Politics in the Pantry, Housewives, Food, and Consumer Protests in 20th Century America. Highly recommend. Now, Emily is a recipient of the American Council of Learned Sciences, Frederick Burkhardt Fellowship, as well as numerous other research grants. She sits on tons of boards. She grew up in New England and after moving around the country, settled in Chicago in 1999. She spent 15 years in the food service industry as a line cook, drive-through cashier, assistant pastry chef, bread baker, scone entrepreneur, we don't know what that is, and a server. She served as president of GEO/UAW Local 2322 at University of Massachusetts Amherst. She was a community organizer with the Campaign for Labor Rights and Jobs with Justice and a member of Unite Here Local 1 and a union steward in downtown Chicago hotel where she worked as a server. Now, I met Emily when I first went to the Polk School in 2017. And when I learned that you could actually teach labor, like she was the first, her and, Stephanie Furtado, who we will also talk about later, they were the first ones that I knew of. They literally taught labor. And I'm like, you can do this as a job, just teach people about labor history. And they were just like, you can make a job, right? So I have so much respect for Emily. And, I thoroughly enjoy working with her. Anytime we're in any kind of anything together, I look forward to her expertise. I look forward to her advice. I look forward to her being the adult in the room. Emily, I appreciate you. I love you. And I look forward to many, many years together in working in partnership. And that, troublemakers, is our episode for this week. Do not forget to like us. Don't forget to share us and don't forget to rate us. And if you would like to give flowers to a member of your community, a member in your union organization, please write to us. Write to us at resolvedlaborpod@gmail.com. I would be honored to read one of your letters in a future episode. Thanks for listening, troublemakers. As always, peace and solidarity. This week's episode of Resolved Labor Podcast is produced by The Create Place Studio. You can find them on all social media platforms at The Create Place STL. We Won is performed by Joe Jinks and written by John O'Connor. This has been Resolved Labor Podcast. As always, peace and solidarity.
Everybody come and join in the union. Begin. Stand together to overcome soon, and we win.